Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Hey, welcome back to The Law Show. I'm Zach Spencer. You're listening to CL 650, and on this show, we're talking about immigration law. Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic are joining us in studio. They're partners, always connected, at MKS. Not always. You have your other partner come in as well. It's always fun having you here. You're very passionate. You know so much about this, and it's ever-changing. You were saying there's probably number 3 in law behind tax and
criminal law.
And criminal law, where there's always changes, right? And speaking of change, a new citizenship law is in the House right now. The Liberals are proposing a new law, and do you think it'll pass before the summer?
It's likely. There's no reason why it wouldn't, other than
time runs out.
Time runs out, basically. In which case, I have no reason to believe, and I don't think Rudy does either, that they won't reintroduce it in September.
So, what is this a controversial new law, or is it pretty benign?
Well, it's not controversial. The previous law, the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act, which was passed in June of 2014, which had the unfortunate tagline, "Harder to get, easier to lose."
Oh, great!
Not the tagline. That was actually that was the name of the bill. That was the decision, not invented by some reporter. That's what we're going to call it.
This is what they called it. This is what the Conservatives called it. Harder to get, easier to lose. Was the first attempt at comprehensive citizenship law reform in quite a while, and in some respects, it was successful. It eliminated certain parts of the 1977 Act that caused enormous amounts of trouble, which was the phrase residence, for example. There's a whole cottage industry of litigation around whether you were here in Canada or not, were you residing?
There's a lot of people would be like well, if you're not in Canada,
sure,
why could we spend all your time in Florida?
Well, they eliminated that and called it physical presence. So, a much easier phrase to understand conceptually and interpret. But like many things, they didn't really get it just right. They went a little further, and some of what they went further on caused considerable consternation amongst the Canadian public and became an election issue. And both the Liberals and the NDP, for example, came out with positions on citizenship where they would repeal some of the provisions that were in the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act.
And what is in this new law that is being repealed?
So the first thing that I'll tackle, and we'll have Rudy talk about the ones that are probably broader. But the controversial one initially was the revocation clauses. The revocation clauses changed the revocation of citizenship procedures so that they went from being a court proceeding to an administrative proceeding. We'll talk about that later in the segment, but the most controversial part was the Canadian citizens who were convicted of treason, sedition, terrorism overseas. Those Canadians could lose their citizenship through an administrative process at the order of the minister with very little recourse.
So you can't go to court.
That's right. If the minister decides because you've been convicted of a terrorism offense overseas, they could simply take your citizenship away.
But you have to have had another citizenship. You need to have a line to another country, don't you? Like if you were,
that
was the slippery part, right?
That was the slippery part. And the challenge was that the way they defined it is that every citizen could lose their citizenship based on this clause unless they could prove they didn't have any other citizenship. So there are all kinds of people who may not have a citizenship of another country now, but might have a right to one. So
if you were born if your parents were born in the UK, and you could
Yeah.
be shipped to the UK.
Well, not even your parents, your grandparents. You may not even know you have that right.
Exactly.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So this bill, that part of the bill was very controversial, and that has been done away with in this new act.
I mean, it's very politically a hot button issue when you take a look at people like Omar Khadr or the gentleman that was recently convicted in Toronto for planning the subway bombings, right?
Yeah, there was the 18,
so,
part of the 18. Yeah.
So they've already stripped his citizenship, right? Was my understanding, right?
They
so
had,
that was
yeah.
done. So now what's going to happen to this bill? Are they going to reinstate that? And you can imagine how that's going to play. We've taken the guy who's convicted of terrorism, and we're going to give him back his Canadian citizenship, right?
It was a hot button issue in the election because the Liberals and the Conservatives came to very different positions on this. The Liberals took the position, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. The place for punishment, and this is what the minister said at our conference, the place for punishment is jail, not stripping citizenship and deporting people. So the idea of classes of citizenship was pretty abhorrent to many people in Canada, and that's the logic behind this change and moving back to where we were before 2014.
I mean, but I think it's understandable when you think about Joe Lunchbox. Like when I talk to my friends, a large percentage of them, have no problem with stripping that citizenship. Like, the guy's a terrorist. Take away citizenship. Why do we want him?
Mm-hmm.
Right? But I think the argument,
which is it's a pretty sort of primitive reaction, right?
yeah, and it's a natural one. But I think we have to look at deeper. What does it mean to be a citizen? Are you part of the family? If you are part of the family, then we'll deal with you as if you are family. And I mean, I was at an event, a political event, and I was talking to a gentleman who was a CEO of a company, and would have been a typical, you think, conservative voter. And he had somebody come up and say, well, why aren't you voting conservative? You should be voting conservative. He's like, listen, if my son gets convicted of a terrorist act, he gets deported back to Pakistan. Mm-hmm. He's like, if your son gets convicted of terrorism, he's in a jail and you can go see him. And and the response was, well, that those terrorists are expensive to keep them in jail. And he's like, yeah, but so is your son. So why should I have to suffer and you not suffer because of where I'm from? Am I a Canadian or not a Canadian?
Well, the other point is, if your great grandparents or grandparents were British or they're from Pakistan, who's to say that Great Britain or Pakistan is going to take this person back?
Well, that's the great thing about citizenship. They actually have to take you if you are a citizen.
Yeah.
That's the beautiful thing about it. You can be an axe murderer and you still have a right to come back.
I mean,
right?
There was a lot of this type of debate, and a lot of people were uneasy with this. It's one thing to deport people who are not citizens. It's a whole other thing to have classes of citizenship. And really, I mean, the voters on this point made their decision.
Yeah.
So that's probably the most hot button of the changes. And but the other changes are less controversial, I would say, but are very important, in particular, in dealing with processing issues. And Rudy, if you can start.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the so the idea was, if you take a look at the old rules, you used to have to be here 75% of the time out of a 4-year period. So 3 out of 4 years when you made your application.
So this is to become a citizenship. You're already a landed immigrant.
You're already a permanent resident.
Permanent resident.
Permanent resident, and then they gave you time for legal time at a 50% rate for at least 1 year of your time before that. So if you were here on a work permit or as a student, the thought is that you were in Canada anyway.
So if you were here for 2 years at school, that counted for 1 year.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So you could actually get some credit, right? You're here rubbing elbows with Canadians and learning the language and learning the culture. So why don't we give you some credit for that? The past government took that away and expanded it to be 4 out of 6 years, right? Mm-hmm. So you had to actually be in Canada longer, which I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, when you think about it, 3 years, really, you can't even finish an undergraduate degree in, and meanwhile, we're going to give you citizenship. But they moved it now to 4 out of, they've moved it back to, they had it at 4 out of 6. This government has now moved it back to, instead of 3 out of 4, they're going to take it to 3 out of 6 and keep the physical requirement, right? So there was the question of residency is gone still, but they're going to count it on feet on the ground. But you only have to be here 50% of the time. 50% of the time.
But then it
it's
takes
actually
longer.
Not, Rudy, I'm sorry to correct you. It's 3 years out of 5.
3 out of 5.
Not 4 years.
Yeah. So not 75%. 60% of the time.
So, but you're still changing the number of years it takes. So it used to be 4 out of 6.
Yeah.
So now you've gone back. You have to only be here
3 out of 5.
5 years.
So it's even less.
Yeah.
Right.
It's even less. And in fact, it's moved back to closer to what it was in the pre-2014 law, because you're getting credit again for study and work permits. The Conservatives eliminated that in the last bill in 2014 in the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act. That has been brought back.
Yeah.
So you had this revocation issue with the last government, and you think that they lost a lot of the immigrant vote based on that. Do you think that the Liberals are getting this right? Do you think they're reading the winds right on this matter, having to be in Canada? What is it? 4 out of 5, right?
3 years out of 5.
3 out of 5, yeah. 3 out of 5 years.
Well,
do you think that's the right number? Like, what is it? So you had the 4 out of 6. You had the Conservatives out of 7, right?
Yeah.
4 out of 6. Now you have 3 years out of 5. Look, I think the major change here is the physical presence test. If you take the word residence out and make this about physical presence, you've eliminated a lot of the problems with the previous act and the previous act's administration. I mean, bad for business. There's not going to be any more litigation on that issue. But it's much more practical in terms of dealing with it. So now we're not talking about 3 years out of 4, and some judges think residence means where you come back to work from work every week. So if you commute somewhere, or if you drive to Seattle for a job and come back 2 days a week, that's still residing in Canada as far as they're concerned. Whereas other judges were like, no, it literally means when you're in Canada. Well, that's gone now. Now it means what it means. Physical presence. End of story. Nothing you can really debate
if
there.
you're spending 8 hours a day in Seattle, that counts as being out of the country?
No, it doesn't, because it's every part of the day.
It doesn't, because part of a day is in Canada.
Right.
So if you were here the rest of the day, you're in Canada.
Now the big question I have is when you fly into Canada,
Yes.
they stamp your passport, but when you leave, they do not.
Yeah, we don't have a. Yeah, sorry.
So how do you track when somebody's come and gone from the country?
That's an excellent question.
Canada doesn't, right?
Canada doesn't, and
So
in citizenship, this is an issue.
So who's going to say I've been here this amount of time? How can you prove it?
Well, you have to. I mean, that's your, when you're making the application, the obligation is on you to say I've been here, and then they ask for evidence. So you got to show your taxes. Then they ask for copies of your passport. Most other countries, when you leave, have stamps of you arriving, right? And we now have information sharing agreements with other countries, such as the United States, so we can see
not
if
all.
you went. But not all.
But
right?
not all. It's true.
So there's wiggle room, but we don't have.
When you go to China,
controls.
you get a little slip of paper, and you better not lose it.
Yeah.
Because when you
Absolutely.
leave, you ought to hand it in.
I mean,
But that said, there's decent exit controls in China that you can access. You can make an application, and they can give you all of your entries and exits. The United States has made a lot of passport information quasi-public, if you will. You put in the number of your passport in their I-94 page, and they'll print out every entry that you've had and every exit that they've recorded. So there are ways you can collect all of this information. So the burden, again, is being placed on the person versus to prove that where they actually were. But that being said, your question earlier was, is it the right way? I mean, given that we're demanding more of the person to prove physical presence, I, for one, don't mind that you've lessened what it appears to be the criteria.
I mean, but I think you've got to. I think more back to your general question, right? Is 3 years enough? Is 3 years enough of living here to count yourself as a citizen? I mean, most other countries, it's not, right? You're looking at a longer period to sort of establish and say where your commitment is. I mean, 3 years, like I said, doesn't even get you an undergraduate degree. So if you move to England for 3 years and study there, are you a citizen at the end of that?
No, you're not.
You know?
But the challenge we have here
But then you're saying, sorry to interrupt, Rudy, Alex, is that you're saying that 3 years only counts for half in the system, right?
It counts for 1 year.
It counts for 1 year. So every year that you're here, well, take the student example out. My question is just, is 3 years enough to sort of count to somebody and say, listen, you're Canadian enough, you can vote, you have an understanding of the political system, we're going to give you all the rights of everybody else here.
I think a lot of people would agree with that. But then your point is, you're boots on the ground, you're here, right?
Yeah.
Boots on the ground, you're here. And look, processing time in the last 5 years has been something like 2 years on average. So it never really was 3 years anyway.
You're here anyway at the end of it. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I mean, so...
That's the common sense approach, too.
Yes.
It's not going to be that quick.
Yeah.
Now, there are some things that they have not done that we're...
well, why don't we pick up on that when we come back from the break?
Certainly.
So we're talking about the new citizenship law that's in the House right now. The Liberal government is hopefully going to push it through the spring session here, and we'll get the new law in place. And we're talking about the changes, and we'll continue the conversation about immigration law next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.